Have you ever wondered why all of these Full Metal Alchemist characters have gates of truth covered in iconography representing their personal backstories? But despite having one of the most insane character backstories of all, Father's door is completely blank. I've been thinking about it a lot, and here's what I've come up with. At first glance, you might think that Father's gate is blank simply because he's not human. After all, if the soul is depicted on the gate, then it makes sense that Father's would be blank because he doesn't have a soul, right? But I actually don't think it had to be like that. Take a moment to consider the other non-human, supposedly soulless characters in Full Metal Alchemist. When you compare their feelings, emotions, and experiences with humanity to Father's, I feel like there's a noticeable difference. Next to Father, it sort of feels like some of the homunculi have at least some of a soul. After witnessing Greed's final moments, for example, it's hard for me to believe that we wouldn't see some kind of representation of his life and experience with humanity represented by truth, the same way that we might for a human character. This makes me think that the 7 homunculi and the characteristics they represent were the humanity offered to the dwarf in the flask. He had a chance to embrace these characteristics, to experience life with their being a part of it, and to maybe even gain some semblance of a soul through this experience. But remember, that's not ever what Father wanted. I feel like it's a fairly common misconception amongst a lot of Full Metal Alchemist characters that Father had some deep down desire to be human, but in fact, that was never really the case. When asked by Hohenheim what he wanted, the dwarf in the flask simply responded that he wanted to be able to move freely throughout the world and not require a container. Of course, Hohenheim and the audience learned very quickly that the dwarf's idea of moving freely through the world came at the expense of others. Because remember, both he and Hohenheim became living embodiments of the Philosopher's Stone. But while Hohenheim walked away from this atrocity with his soul intact, Father had a very different experience. And I think that has less to do with his start as an artificial being, as it has to do with the fact that he rejected humanity when he had a chance at it. In order to obtain freedom by his definition, the dwarf in the flask couldn't handle the emotion and weakness that is a part of being human. So he cast off his humanity and became Father, a being in pursuit of absolute power at the expense of any chance of a soul. In doing so, he genuinely believed he had a chance at seizing control of the universe. But when he came face to face with the Gate of Truth, nothing looked back at him but a blank door. This isn't to say that he didn't have an effect on the world. He certainly did. But I would argue that his choice to cast off everything that made him human made it impossible for the world to affect him. And he spent his last moments shouting in confusion, unsure what he even did wrong. At the end of the day, the choice to remain soulless was the choice to remain the dwarf in the flask. He was limited in what he could learn or how he could move, and he had nothing to show for himself but a blank door. What do you think? Did Father ever have a chance at a soul? More analysis tomorrow. Follow to stay on FMA Talk.